Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmerced.com, and you're watching this video where I'm going to be discussing common libertarian critiques. And basic idea is I put out a request for what people felt were some of the common critiques that they would run into when they would advocate for libertarianism and libertarian ideas. And my goal is to go through each of these sort of critiques, give my take, and help give you tools to better advocate for liberty. Is this going to be the end all be all? No. Bottom line, if you want to be a better advocate, you always have to be learning more. You always have to be talking more. We're all going to end up in discussions with people, and we're going to make mistakes. We're going to make assumptions in the middle of a conversation that, in retrospect, maybe we shouldn't have. But that's how we learn in the next conversation how to better advocate for liberty. But one of the things, before I say anything else, that I always recommend is listening. Before you go full on in trying to advocate for your ideas, first learn what the values and the ideas of the person you're talking to are. Because this will, one, help you tailor your message to appeal to their values, and two, help know which basically arguments you might make may trigger them sort of having a negative reaction. So you know sort of where the minefield is, so that way you can focus on where you're going to be most compelling, so that way you can get them thinking in that direction. Because at the end of the day, you're not going to, most people become fully libertarians or all-encompassing libertarians not in one conversation, not because of any conversation, but because there was something that was compelling, even if it was just in one or two areas, that inspired them to look deeper into it, to learn a little bit more about the history, to learn a little bit more about the philosophy, to learn a little bit more about economics, that then gets them more holistically libertarian. It's a journey. Doesn't happen in one day. So the focus should be getting them to at least open up to walking down that path. So one of the best tools you can do is, again, listen to them, identify where you can make the strongest arguments for them, and focus there instead of trying to argue every libertarian position all the time, which is, again, maneuvering a minefield. Sometimes it's okay to just say, you know what, I'm not going to be able to convince you in this conversation, but at least let's agree on this. And all I ask is that you keep asking questions, that you keep walking down that road and trying to learn more, and let them walk away with that. Because at least they'll keep moving forward. So it's okay to end a conversation on that note, instead of having to argue it until they just can't stand listening to you anymore. So the first one, society is too complex to let people do what they want. Now, what happens here is people assume, one of the biggest assumptions that I see happen over and over again is that people assume that the way the world needs to work is the way it works now. So that means whether something is a good idea or a bad idea is just relevant whether the way the world works now is just better. They don't necessarily imagine that maybe the world working differently is better, because what happens is over time government has put in several policies in place. This has affected the way that people have made decisions on how they've employed their resources, their labor, etc. And yes, if you pull these policies out of place, whether there's certain subsidies, certain tax rules, etc., the way people have organized isn't necessarily going to work anymore. And there is going to be certain fallout in certain areas where people have businesses that are viable only with these particular policies in place. But that doesn't mean removing the policy is a bad idea. That just means putting the policy in the first place created dependencies that create these problems. Because the problem with any particular policy is, yeah, maybe the policy may have X outcome that you like, but it does, again, create these businesses that can only exist because of that policy. And two, what happens when the government, if there's a situation where the government can't afford to continue these policies going forward, then you're going to have all of these businesses kind of readjusting, failing, or going through tough times all at the same time. So that's why you rather have an economy, have a structure of an economy that is based on what people can do absent of government. Because regardless of what's going on with government, that economy can survive. That economy can continue when there's a sort of government hiccup. So you want as much of the way we invest and whatnot to be sort of absent of those kind of external investments. And so yes, there is a complex web because of all the policies that have kind of pyramided on each other over decade, over decade, over decade. There's nothing wrong with acknowledging that, and acknowledging that is not necessarily a knock on libertarianism. And libertarianism, I mean, again, goes across several grades. So it's not necessarily saying, okay, let's remove every single one of these policies at the same time and let the chips fall where they may. Some may advocate for that. But others may say, you know what, let's begin unwinding the spaghetti. Because we do want to get to that place where the ability for society to stay held up shouldn't necessarily be dependent on this complex weave of reactionary policies from decades and decades and decades. But if we unwind it, remove some of these policies, let society adjust, remove some of these policies, we can get to that point where society is more self-sustainable because assets, investments have redeployed themselves. Okay? So people, again, are always thinking that it's day one to day two. And yes, you could theoretically just rip everything off. There may be sort of a very frictionful moment for a period of time. Things will still redeploy themselves. Society will rebuild. But again, I think most people would prefer less friction as possible. So again, that's why oftentimes, especially with a non-libertarian, you're better off advocating sort of the slow untangling approach. And just say, yes, society is complex. But government only makes it more complicated, and when government makes society more complicated, what happens is that you're going to have there's going to be a greater likeliness that something goes wrong. Okay, because then what happens is that people make their decisions based on what they expect and what they understand. And the more everything around them is complicated, the more likeliness they're going to make a decision that doesn't anticipate correctly. So what you do want is simpler institutions. Whether it be private or public institutions, you want them to be simpler, more predictable, etc. And one way to do that is to unwind all these weird government rules that have made it more complex, made it harder for people to plan for themselves. So that kind of went into a lot of different places, but that's sort of kind of my thought process when I hear that. What about the kids? Okay, everyone always thinks that if you just, absent of government, basically everyone will just suffer. Basically, kids won't have health care, they won't have schools, there'll be no roads, everyone's going to be doing drugs. And so I'm going to kill a couple birds with this. Now, what about the kids? Who has generally taken care of the kids from the first place? The parents. Now, does every parent do a good as job as the next parent? No. But the problem is, when the government gets too involved, yes, occasionally it may help compensate for parents that maybe didn't do as good of a job. But at the same time, it may also limit the ability for good parents to do a better job. And that's not necessarily a good thing either. And the problem is, when you eliminate diversity, and this is what things like the Department of Education and other institutions that try to standardize things do. They try to prevent the bad, but at the same time they limit the good. And that diversity is important because it's by letting people do really good and seeing what mistakes look like, it discourages people from making those mistakes again. So when, parents see maybe one parent who didn't do as good a job, they see what they do, they may not do what they did. When we see parents who did a phenomenal job, we're going to want to copy what they did. But the less you let parents be involved in their kids' lives, the less that diversity is. The less you let, and I don't mean just basically in raising their kids, I mean in being able to choose what school they go to or how they educate their kids. Because again, education doesn't necessarily equal schooling. Schooling is one way to educate your kids, but there may be all sorts of diverse ways depending on how the kid best learns. This is why school choice is such a big thing for libertarians. But also when it comes to like healthcare. If you had a more consumer-oriented market, and when it comes to healthcare, the best thing you can do to be a better advocate or debater in that realm is read the book, The Primal Prescription. I can't summarize that book in 5 minutes, but get the book, The Primal Prescription by Robert Murphy and Doug McGuff. They do a really good job of getting to the history of the U.S. healthcare system, so that way you can actually explain to people why healthcare costs so much, why the healthcare insurance market is so bizarre, and explain that that's not a market system. A more market-oriented system would be one where consumers make decisions about their purchases regarding healthcare, which would create incentives for the providers of healthcare to tailor their product to consumers, instead of the situation now where medical practice tailor their practice to insurance companies, and insurance companies tailor their products to employers, all of which aren't the healthcare consumer. So no one's tailoring it for the consumer because they're not the one with the agency. They're not the one making the decision to pay. Who's making the decision to pay? The health insurance company, the employer who purchases the healthcare insurance, not necessarily you or me who's going to the doctor. So the incentives to really cater to the consumer is not there. And introducing a third-party payer doesn't necessarily improve that incentive. So again, The Primal Prescription is a good book that goes into the history of that. But again, that's another issue where people could get concerned about the kids. And the third area where people get concerned about the kids is drugs. But basically the problem right now is you do have a huge black market for drugs, and those drug dealers are more likely to target kids than necessarily, let's say, CVS. So if people could purchase drugs in a store, there is a greater ability for society to put pressure and societal pressure on not selling to kids, in the same sense in what you see with drugs and cigarettes and alcohol. Although kids still drink and smoke. So even then, sometimes maybe a social taboo doesn't necessarily have the most effective. Because actually where you do see less smoking, less drinking among kids aren't the places where there's the biggest societal or legal taboos when it comes to drugs. It's actually where it's the least. Partly because kids do have a tendency of wanting to rebel. So the more something becomes a symbol of rebellion, the more kids kind of want to do it. So, but that becomes a more of a cultural thing and a cultural debate that should just be had between you and how you participate in society and the culture that develops out of it. But the point being is that there's nothing, whether it's education, health, or safety, that would necessarily just be ignored. Parents aren't going to suddenly stop caring about their kids' safety, health, and well-being. They would just create different institutions around it. Maybe more non-profit institutions. There may be for-profit businesses to cater to the demand to fill these things. And you already see that today. There are plenty of institutions that are privately made by concerned citizens, by businesses, to address issues that parents have with kids. Where there's a demand, someone will try to find a way to cater that to demand. That's just kind of the way things work. And it's not always just purely out of financial incentives. There are people out there who do it out of the pure goodness of their heart. Libertarianism works only in a bubble. Now, I think this is more of a critique you have from people who are, one, concerned about a libertarian culture in a sense, where they believe that basically people can only be free if everyone has that free culture. So this is when kind of like when you meet people who are very, very hesitant about immigration, because their concern is if you have a bunch of people from other countries that don't have the same culture as us, then they're going to get rid of freedom, which I find it to be a weird argument. Because in my experience, most times, some of the people who I feel, who I've seen that are oftentimes most vested into freedom are immigrants, because they come here, they experience the benefit of having opportunities they didn't have before, or freedoms they didn't have before on what they can do and the opportunities that they have, that they know what the alternative is, and they become more vested in it than those who've never really experienced the alternative. Okay? Oftentimes the people who are sort of the biggest enemies of liberty are people who have only known liberty, so they take it for granted. So all they see is the imperfections in liberty without really appreciating the imperfections because they haven't experienced the worst. So oftentimes it's the most privileged among us who are the people who advocate against the things that allow people to be privileged, in a sense, that allow us to have a more robust economy, a more free society, and things like that. So there's that. But there's also another argument where I see this kind of take place is with things like the Federal Reserve, where people want to say, well, you can't have a free market in money because, well, other countries have central banks and they're manipulating the value of their currencies. So in that case, we need to have a central bank and have similar policies just as a response to those countries. But if that's how everyone operated, that would be, if I always have to, basically, it's kind of like saying when a football player takes steroids, they're saying, well, I have to take steroids because everybody else takes steroids. That doesn't necessarily justify the use of steroids. Okay? The fact that everybody else does it doesn't justify it, and doesn't necessarily mean that's the best course of action. If everyone does something stupid for short-term benefit, doesn't mean everybody else has to too. Now, yes, it may sometimes be difficult to make that choice, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's the wrong choice, because sometimes there's long-term benefits. So, for example, if you're that one football player who just had to work out extra hard and practice extra long to be able to compete with everybody else who's taking steroids, I mean, one, you'll be a better player for it, and probably have a longer career because you're going to have a longer life. So, there are benefits sometimes taking the high, well, actually, there usually is benefits to taking the high road. So in that case, the fact that other countries don't necessarily always operate with the sort of the most libertarian-friendly policies doesn't mean we should adopt similar policies. And at the same time, oftentimes, by having more freedom-oriented policies here, we inspire the people of other countries to take on those policies. We don't inspire freedom around the world because we just go and take out dictators around the world. We inspire freedom across the world because people can see the benefits, the tangible, not just economic value, but societal value. See, people who are happy, people who have things that other people don't have, and they're like, you know what? Why can't we do that? And people around the world say, you know what? I would like the freedom to be able to dance with my friends. I would like the freedom to be able to complain when my government does something horrible. And when they see that here in countries that are freer, that inspires them to fight for those things in their country. So, if anything, you want more libertarianism here, so we can inspire that libertarianism abroad. And it doesn't only work in a bubble, in my opinion. If anything, libertarianism creates libertarianism. When people taste freedom, they want more of it. Problem is, again, sometimes you have people with so much freedom, they don't appreciate, they've kind of gorged and don't necessarily appreciate what they have. And then those are oftentimes the people who advocate against it. Or people who have just successfully convinced people that other people's freedoms are what's caused their oppression, instead of realizing that it's their lack of freedom that is their oppression. The social safety net. Libertarians believe in a social safety net. There's nothing wrong. All a social safety net is means that there are things to help people when things go wrong. Okay, life is unpredictable. There are unpredictable situations in life. The only difference is that as a libertarian, I prefer a more decentralized, individualized safety net. Meaning, I prefer that the safety net be a mix of for-profit insurance programs mixed with non-profit or for-profit charitable organizations and community outreach programs, etc. The reason, a couple of reasons being, is one, I prefer decentralized because of the whole systematic risk. So for example, if you have a national healthcare system and that system fails, everybody's out of healthcare. But if you have several different ways of providing healthcare, then if one system fails, not everyone suffers because people are participating in different systems. So maybe there is health insurance companies. Maybe people pay out of pocket for certain healthcare systems. Maybe people create other types of group organizations where they voluntarily get together to provide each other healthcare. There's all sorts of models that I probably haven't even imagined. But I'd rather have a bunch of diverse models sort of trying to make it work and seeing what the result is. And then again, oftentimes, and then those kind of for-profit insurance models can allow people who can afford it to provide for themselves. But at the same time, you can have non-profits provide for those who can't. And people go, well, there's not enough. Well, the thing is that if you had a more libertarian economic policy and you had a more robust economy, the amount of people who don't get caught by the, let's say, who can't find a service to provide for them because of a lack of resources, it'll be a much smaller group that can be caught by that charitable sector. Also, that charitable sector will be bigger. Because one of the things that are keeping the amount of charity small is policy. because charity requires resources to be donated. It requires time for volunteers. When people are paying more taxes and having to cover the cost of more regulations, that means they have to work longer hours to make up for that. So they don't necessarily have the money to donate or the time to volunteer because of the cost of policy. So if you can reduce the cost, the burden of government-wise on people's incomes, that frees up the resources to donate, frees up the time for people to volunteer, and you will have more of that. At the same time, people will be better off. So in that case, by having a more robust economy, you reduce the need, the scope of the demand for a social safety net to the point where basically, again, for-profit insurance companies, so car insurance is a social safety net. It protects you when you crash your car. Insurance companies are a safety net. That's essentially what they are. When anyone advocates the government to do it, they just want insurance that they don't pay for. But paying for insurance is really important, because when an insurance company prices insurance, they're pricing in the potential risk you have. This incentivizes you to reduce the risk in your life. So when they charge you more for a car insurance because you're buying a particular car, well, then you know that buying that car is riskier than buying another car, and that might discourage you from buying the riskier car, the car that's more likely to be stolen or something like that. So those prices help manage behavior in a way where a lot of these negative situations where you need these insurance programs happen less often, which means society is structurally more sound. So yes, again, social safety net. The only problems that you often see in insurance companies nowadays here in the US is that insurance companies are oftentimes regulated at a state level. So basically there's a lack of competition because they're heavily regulated by each individual state, resulting in a very lack of competition within the state, and you can't really go to another state to buy insurance from that state. So, a more national insurance market where you have more competitors and more diversity of choices in which you can buy as far as your insurance products is really what you need in order to create that social safety net. Also, privatizing some of the insurance things that we do now through the government, such as unemployment and deposit insurance. Imagine if people bought their own unemployment insurance. People sometimes need more than 6 months of unemployment insurance. Sometimes people need less. You can buy the amount that is right for you. But at the same time, the insurance company would have an incentive to, one, price the risk. So you go to work for a company that has a higher turnover rate, that unemployment insurance will be more expensive and might discourage you from going to a company with higher turnover, which creates an incentive for a company to treat their employees better. So that way there isn't a high turnover. So that way so it creates new economic incentives that don't exist that actually benefit employees, consumers, etc. That right now, since those incentives don't exist, people advocate for government to supplant rules to replace those incentives, which is again the wrong route to go, because what happens when the government falls apart or the wrong administration's in place, then those rules aren't enforced. It's better that you have an actual functioning pricing system dictate those incentives. Drugs. At the end of the day, people do drugs regardless. Basically, all government involvement in trying to prevent drug use has only made outcomes worse. Let's examine reasons why people want there to be sort of a war on drugs. Because they want there to be less drug use. But there's no demonstration that there is less drug use because of the drug war. Okay? Instead, you have black market drug dealers who are going to be willing to practice sort of less ethical sales tactics than for-profit drug dealers, because they're not subject to the same level of transparency as a for-profit business that's legal. People can see what that business is doing and judge them for it. But if you're doing something illegal, it's already illegal. The shame is already there, so there's no reason why you just don't cross the boundaries to further unethical behavior. So you start selling to really young kids, and then once you get those kids on a lighter drug like marijuana, since they're already coming to you, you try to upsell them to something more dangerous. So it's not that marijuana is a gateway drug. It really isn't. A lot of people do marijuana and they don't necessarily ever go to harder drugs. But the fact that you're making it illegal and forcing them to go to the to a black market drug dealer, there is a likelihood that black market drug dealer, who's more likely to be unethical, will unethically try to push them to harder drugs that are more addictive, meaning make them more of a return customer. And at the same time, there's a likelihood that the drugs they do sell them aren't necessarily pure, making it more likely there's going to be overdoses. So you're only increasing the negative outcomes by waging a drug war. So having drugs provided, or anything that's illegal currently provided in a more transparent market, can at least allow there for be more accountability, because I mean, anyone would rather go to a store, a normal store where you don't have people with like guns watching you. Instead, you can just go to the store, buy it at the counter. People would prefer to go to those places than into an alleyway. And if they go there, there's going to be more transparency and more societal pressures on those businesses to act in a more ethical manner with the way they sell their drugs. I'm not saying perfectly ethical. I mean, society, at the end of the day, you individuals do have to hold each other accountable. That's the way things work. Even with government or without government, you have to sit there and say, okay, I don't like the way this person's behaving, and call them out. But you only can really do that for people who are operating in a legal fashion. People who operate in the black market are completely hidden and non-transparent, so it's hard to apply those pressures. So I don't see any reason our government involvement in drugs has improved the situation. Poverty. Going back to that whole social safety net thing I was talking about before. You have more of a freer market that has, creates prices that create better incentives for people to organize and plan. Because again, people are making decisions based on all the incentives in their lives, the prices of the insurance they have to buy, the food they have to buy, and whatnot. So if you have more accurate market prices, the incentives for people to make decisions that are to everyone's benefit are going to be more there. So people are going to coordinate with each other better. So you're going to have less poverty because of that. But at the same time, you'll also have more people will have more time, people will have more resources to help provide a safety net for those who are poor, and there'll be more opportunities for those who are poor. Also, a lot of times, being poor is just made harder because the government creates standards on what can be provided. So, for example, think of local housing codes. So basically, the housing a developer can create has to come with fixed certain things, like so many rooms, the rooms have to be so big, etc. Because of that, you can't create lower cost alternatives. And then when you throw in taxes and other regulations that increase costs, what happens is hard to create a lower cost alternative for those who have less. So that way there is an option for those who have less. Now people have innovated, so you have things like tiny houses becoming popular and whatnot to create lower cost housing alternatives. But imagine this across the board with food, housing, healthcare, etc. By trying to regulate and create sort of a minimum quality, you price out people who have less. Imagine, I think a great analogy that's used, and I think it was actually an analogy used by Milton Friedman, and I think it was quoted in the book, The Primal Prescription. Imagine that in order for car safety, that the government just said everyone has to drive a Lexus. And the argument is, well, if everyone drives a Lexus, that's a much safer car. So in that case, everyone will be better off. But not everyone can afford a Lexus. So sure, you've made it where only safer cars are on the market, but you also made it where many people can't afford a car. And even if they had to buy a less safer car, they still would have been better off with a car. So same thing with poverty. So we do that across the board with all sorts of different goods and services, where we say this is the least good thing you can buy, but because of that, the least good is still out of reach for a lot of people. So we make the effects of poverty worse through a lot of our policies. And then again, through our economic policies, we make it where there's more poverty and less things to help with that poverty. So bottom line is, a more limited government, a smaller government, can make a big difference there. Inequality. Now, I take inequality separate as poverty because I think people conflate the two. Okay, they see poverty and they say that's inequality. That is not the same thing. Inequality is just sort of a gap between the top and the bottom. And a gap between the top and the bottom is not necessarily a bad or a good thing. It depends why it's happening. Okay? Some inequality that occurs with it. And when I talk about inequality, I'm using the same style that most people talk about, which is either inequality of wealth. So you're taking like the highest net worth and the lowest net worth, which is actually a very bad tool to use because of the way balance sheets work. Or inequality of income. So what's the highest annual income versus lowest annual income was maybe a little bit better metric to look at, but still missing a lot of things. But the thing is, inequality can result from several different factors. Some of those factors aren't bad things. They're actually signals to show the effects of bad policies. Other sources of inequality may be caused directly by bad policies. So for example, right now, people who have skills like programming, engineering, sort of STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, those skills make a lot more than those who don't. And the reason for that is the lack of them, supply and demand. There's a lot less people who have science, technology, education, math skills, so they come at a higher premium. So there's going to be a natural level of inequality between people who have those skills, who specialize, and those who haven't, especially in a world where technology has moved up, where the benefits of that and the demand for lack of skills, so like nowadays we have automation, things like that make the demand for no skills a lot less. We don't necessarily need people to just push stuff around or assemble things, a lot less. So basically the return on having no skills has become less, and the return on having skills and certain skills have become more. That tells you two things. One, for some reason we don't have enough people to have those skills, so certain incentives to get those skills for some reason don't exist, which you can look at policy that have affected how education's priced and different things, and the way we finance education. Also, that increase in pay creates an incentive to get those skills. So when I see that a science, technology, engineering, or math person makes so much more than someone who doesn't necessarily have those skills, it creates an incentive to go get those skills. So if you try to bridge that inequality and say, okay, well, let's tax the science, technology, engineering, and math people more, and then use that money to give to the people who are with less skills, who are making less, well, then that gap, that incentive, that premium you make is less there, so then the benefit of me going out there and getting those skills becomes a lot less. So you dampen those incentives. The reason why that incentive is widening is because apparently it's necessary to incentivize people. Well, because if not, then there would be more science, technology, engineering, math people to prevent that premium from rising. Okay, so the only reason that gap would widen is because incentives are not sufficient in its current matter. So that's not necessarily a bad thing. That's creating the incentives for the next generation to invest their education dollars towards where it's needed, where society has demand. That's a good thing. But there are other reasons why inequality happens that are not good. So, for example, when the government creates regulations that increase the cost of doing business, well, what's going to happen? People who are wealthier are going to be able to pay, and businesses that are more established are going to be able to pay to deal and comply with those regulations. While those who want to start a business now are not going to be able to deal with those regulations. So then what happens, it makes it harder for people to start new businesses and bring themselves out of poverty, and then makes it easier for those who are already doing well, who already exist within these markets, to capture more market share because they're protected from competition. That increases inequality. Or monetary policy, where if you have inflationary monetary policy that increases the value of money because people want to play around with trade, what happens is that you do decrease the value of people's wages, but at the same time you increase the value of people's assets. And there's nothing wrong with asset prices increasing if the value of the asset has risen. But if the only reason the dollar amount of the asset of stocks, bonds, real estate is going up is just because we printed more money, you're taking away from people's paychecks and giving it to people who already have highly valued assets. So you end up creating inequality that way as well. But inequality isn't caused by necessarily a free market. It isn't because people are freely able to make decisions. Inequality is just a response to incentives that are in the market, oftentimes created by government policies like the ones I mentioned before, where whether it be education, because in education what happened is that since they made education loans so easy, it's made it a lot easier for people to get pretty much any degree they want. And people don't realize whether they got the a degree that's best suited for them until way after they have way too much in debt. So then you have this huge disparity of people with huge loans without ability to make an income to service those loans versus people who did get science, technology, engineering, math degrees, and they're doing really well. And then again, the regulation story hurting entrepreneurship, and then the monetary policy story, stealing from wages and giving it to assets. So all these things create that inequality, but it's not because people aren't taxed enough. It's not because people are rich and allowed to be rich. That is not the case. And nor does that explain anything in a causal way. Libertarianism can't win. Well, libertarianism, the reason you believe in anything shouldn't be whether it wins or not. Okay? Again, this goes back to the whole steroid thing. If the fact that maybe taking steroids makes it more likely that you're going to succeed in sports, that in itself is not an argument to take steroids. Sometimes doing the right thing does require you to give up short-term gain. But oftentimes, the right choice can offer you all sorts of long-term benefits and sustainable gains. That's why I like the steroid analogy, because you kind of catch that. It's the person who works harder, eats healthier, exercises more, they're more likely to be able to succeed for a longer period of time, even if they don't succeed necessarily in the short run. In the long run, they're better off. And because the process of doing that, you learn what gives you that outcome, and you're able to sustain that outcome. When you take a shortcut, you get the outcome you may want for a period of time, but you have no idea how to sustain it because you didn't learn what creates it. You just took a shortcut. So yeah, libertarianism can be a tough sell sometimes because people are scared of freedom. People always want their own freedom, but people are always scared of everybody else. They're scared of what the other person's going to do. And it does take time to explore and get to a point where you can feel comfortable with other people's freedom. But libertarianism can win. It can win when you decide to help it win. But whether it can or can't win doesn't change the fact of whether it's right or wrong. And if it's right, whether you should adopt the right ways, the right methods, the right ideas. Education versus politics. So this is more specifically about the Libertarian Party, whether people look at the Libertarian Party as an actual political vehicle to make actual policy changes, or just an education vehicle to educate people on libertarianism. And I don't see why that's a debate, in the sense that all political parties are both. People use the Democrat and Republican and Libertarian Party to educate people through their runs for office and whatnot, even when they're not sure if they're going to win. Okay, there's many elections are elections where basically it's pretty obvious one particular party is going to win versus the other, but they still run another candidate because it helps build towards the long run. And at the same time, you win when people begin to agree with you. So education is required to have political ends. So if the Libertarian Party will win elections, it's going to depend on whether we can educate people onto why libertarianism provides value to their daily lives. Makes it easier for them to succeed by lowering the barriers that prevent them from succeeding by starting their own business or seeking out skills that they may want, and lowering the costs in doing so. Or freeing up their time so that way they can donate to the charities they like and volunteer at the charities they like, or spend more time with their family. Once we're able to make that case better and more people begin to embrace that case, the education will lead to political wins. So these are not two mutually exclusive things. Now, yes, there may be people who run, and their particular campaign may be for the purposes of education, but it all contributes to that eventually political wins. Because again, politics, elections are a lagging indicator. People's hearts and minds change first, and they vote based on where their hearts and minds are. So how the outcome of elections is just a reflection of where society is now. Doesn't mean it's a reflection of where society is going. The environment. Okay, now the story with the environment is this. People are worried about, like, well, if we don't force people to not pollute and whatnot. And a lot of the times, environmental issues have a lot to do with very poorly enforced property rights in a couple different matters. And property rights are important because it tells you who is responsible for something. So, for example, there's a tragedy of the commons where basically there's a river that's owned by nobody. Makes it easy for anyone to go pollute that river because there's nobody who kind of has an interest in keeping an eye on the river until somebody complains and it's too late. But I mean, if everything is owned, so for example, if you were to start dumping, and I mean, if you take a look at historical where people try to dump like environmentally unsafe stuff, like let's say like toxic waste or something like that, they're never depositing in someone's backyard per se. They're usually depositing it in like a public river or something like that. Something that's not necessarily owned by anybody, so there's no one who's going to quickly complain. If I did dump it in your backyard, you'd be quick to complain and quick to sue. And that's the benefit of private property. When people do own things, people have an interest in protecting those things because they want it to continue to yield value for them. So one is exploring the idea of who owns these lands and who should, so that way there is someone who has a vested interest in protecting those lands, and also jurisprudence in court cases regarding damage that is caused. So like if someone has pollutes the air and pollutes the air because the factory down the street pollutes the air around your house, do you have a claim to sue them and say, hey, you're causing damage to my property and damage to my health, you owe me? I think there's a strong case for that, that what you put into the air, if it goes into other people's property, you can be sued for that. Okay, but the problem is that's more of a changes that have to go with the way judges and lawyers argue cases. And I think that'll have a much more profound change on protecting the environment instead of forcing people. Also, many of the biggest changes in protecting the environment haven't come from laws, but have come from people choosing to be more environmentally friendly. Why? Because people have educated each other. Like people always point to Al Gore's documentary, The Inconvenient Truth. Now, regardless of the merits of the documentary itself, many people watched that documentary and changed their behavior. Not many laws got changed, not much else got changed, but it did change a lot of people to actually start being concerned about the goods that they use and their consumer behavior. So Al Gore essentially made more change as a private actor through private voluntary means by encouraging people to make voluntarily different decisions. He did a lot more to achieve his ends than he actually did through policy. And I think that no stronger argument for what the right path is, educating people and trying to make the case to people why they should make different decisions, is more than just forcing people. Because when you force people to do something, they'll just do it less transparently. So if you just said everybody has to start using less carbon per se, but people don't fully, truly, at their heart appreciate why, they're just going to keep doing it secretly. So, the fact that libertarians don't advocate government to force people to be more environmentally friendly doesn't necessarily mean we don't care about the environment. We do. We just think that the best thing you can do for the environment is, one, have stronger property rights enforcement through the legal system, and also have consumer advocates who will go out there and advocate for more environmentally friendly practices, and people invest in businesses that they believe in, that are environmentally friendly, or donate to charities to educate people, or help subsidize the research of technologies that may not necessarily be currently get capital in for-profit capital markets. Roads. Okay, everybody's favorite, roads. This is the idea is basically, well, without government, then who's going to build the roads? Now, there's two ways you can look at this. One, I don't think most libertarians are saying, oh, let's go get rid of all public roads right now. Most public roads are created by your local government and organized by your local community, not necessarily a federal top-down approach. Okay, so, and most libertarians would probably prefer more local community governments making more decisions than not. So the roads thing is a very poor argument. And if roads is the only thing you have left, and you're saying, well, we need to have government for roads, so we're willing to put up with a surveillance state, with all these regulations, all these taxes, just so we can have some roads, which are a fraction of the cost of government. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, then you're missing the point. But let's talk about the roads. Okay, so one, yeah, local governments typically make the roads, and so that wouldn't necessarily disappear. Local communities would still have an interest of getting together and building roads. But let's say, we did have an area where the only roads that existed were for-profit roads. It would just be different. Imagine a world where basically you did have to pay for use of the roads. You'd have something like an easy pass that keeps track of how many miles you drove, and then you'd get a bill at the end of the month to pay the proper road operator. Okay, so now we have the GPS technology where that wouldn't really be that complicated to do. Well, what happened is people would try to drive less. So in that case, carpooling may become more of a thing. Public transportation, as far as buses, may become more of a thing, which is good for the environment, isn't it? So for all those of you who are concerned about the environment, that would be pretty cool, wouldn't it? Also, the infrastructure would cost less because since less people are driving on the roads, or less vehicles are on the roads, you're going to be maintaining them less often, or costing less to maintain them, so that's less resources that need to be going to infrastructure, which means more resources for other parts of the economy. That's a good thing. Also, the way people plan their businesses, plan their homes, will be different. You might start seeing more mixed space usage. Imagine like a Walmart with a giant apartment complex built on top of it. That way, you don't necessarily have to drive so far. Okay, this big giant skyscraper with a Walmart at the bottom will have mixed space. There may be office spaces within the building. So maybe you would work in the same building you live in and do all the shopping there, and that would minimize the amount of road you need. We would just rethink our use of space because there'd be a cost to that additional use of space, which means there would be more green space. That means there'd be more trees, more fields, which is also good for the environment because we wouldn't want to necessarily be built all spread out because there's a cost in the extra roads and the maintenance of those roads if you build further out, which would be more felt by consumers if they were paying for the mileage of road that they were driving on. So, yeah, there would still be an incentive to create roads. You're not going to have what you have now, theoretically, if you didn't have the government involved the way it was, but the alternative wouldn't have necessarily been bad. And again, this is just like theoretical. You have the roads you have now, and that's done. But it doesn't necessarily mean we can't. The incentives of private markets wouldn't necessarily still play a good role in more better stewardship of our resources going forward. So the roads to me are just a very poor example. And again, if there wasn't roads, or let's say again, if there wasn't the massive subsidies of roads, especially like interstate highways, stuff like that over the years, there would be different transportation systems to be worked out. We might have had more railroads, or planes might have been even more adapted than they have been. There's all sorts of different things that might have worked out differently. You don't know how it would have worked out. But what I can definitely assure you is people wouldn't have just sat around and twiddled their thumbs and had nothing happen. People would have got together and tried to figure out, okay, how do we make this work? Because everyone has their self-interest at heart that there's benefits from me going out there and making this happen. So, yeah, roads, poor argument. So that's the end of the presentation. Thank you guys very much for listening to this. I know it's been a long presentation, about 50 minutes, but thank you. My name is Alex Merced from alexmerced.com, so please do go check out alexmerced.com. I have several different weekly podcasts that I do, which you can subscribe to on iTunes, Google Play, and Stitcher, which I highly recommend that you listen to. Such as Breaking Progressives, where I talk about different left-wing articles and kind of break down their narratives. There's the Alex Merced cast, where I interview people every week, so subscribe to those. And if you like what I've been doing and you want to see me keep making more videos like this, please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/alexmerced. This allows me to get the resources to purchase the equipment so that we can do this better, and better. It allows me to keep up with the cost of all the domain name, web hosting, all this stuff for the stuff that I do. And basically allows me to dedicate more time to it. So please do consider doing that, patreon.com/alexmerced. Thank you very much. This is Alex Merced. Have a great day and enjoy.